What's going on, family? I'm Scrapbook Boxing. The Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuff series will continue its conversation with you concerning the complete history of boxing. Now, we took a look at 1900 through 1915. During the course of our conversation, we learned about the Hall of Famers, the World Championship fights, and the World Champions. We understood about the landmarks and those who may have made contributions to the game. I specifically chose fighters that I felt were significant in the benchmarking of the conversation of fighters who changed the game. We took a look at Peter Jackson, the Black Prince. We take a look at Jack Johnson, the Galveston Giant. We even took a look at Sam Langford, the Boston Bone Crusher. Right now, we're going to take a look at Frank Craig, the Harlem Coffee Cooler. Now, before we look at Frank Craig, the Harlem Coffee Cooler, let's take a look at the name and really break down the name, the Harlem Coffee Cooler. Now, Frank Craig, he was originally from Columbus, Georgia. He would move to Harlem, New York. So the Harlem part of his name was the location that he lived. They call him the coffee cooler. This is where it becomes derogatory, because the image of coffee is black, and that symbolizes the skin tone of Frank Craig. But where it really becomes derogatory is the terminology coffee cooler, because it comes from water cooler. Water cooler normally means when a group of people gather around a water cooler, they have conversations, they take a break, they take time off to talk about whatever the topic is during the time that these individuals are around a water cooler. Did you see the fight last night? My kid won't listen to me. Whatever the conversation is. So the image of coffee cooler is the image of water cooler. But in the Civil War, when the black soldiers used to take coffee breaks, they would consider them slacking, lazy, don't want to perform. So the Harlem Coffee Cooler was a black fighter who was lazy and didn't want to perform. He was considered a yellow streak, heartless, was not competitive. That's where the Harlem Coffee Cooler came from, and it was given to Frank Craig as the Harlem Coffee Cooler. And I wanted to make that clear as we continue our conversation and learn more about Frank Craig, the Harlem Coffee Cooler. Born April 1st, 1868 in Columbus, Georgia, Frank Craig, as I stated, ran through Harlem, New York. He would die January 1st, 1943. He was 73 years of age at the time of his death, and he would reside in Chelsea, London, England. He stood 5 foot 10 inches, weighed 153 to 169 pounds. He was managed by Danny Butler, and he managed himself. He would become the colored world middleweight champion when he would defeat a fighter by the name of Joe Butler in 4 rounds, February 20th, 1894. Let's stop right there. If you only knew the impact that fight made in Philadelphia and in New York, because New York and Philadelphia had their rivalries to begin with. It was such an impact. It puts me in mind of March 17th, 1990. Meldrick Taylor and Julio Cesar Chavez. Let's go back and break down the significance and the comparison of this fight. Now, February 14th, 1988, at the Memorial Coliseum, Corpus Christi, Texas, a young man that was 24 years old from Long Island, his name is Buddy McGirt. He was 36-1 when he took on 29-year-old Frankie Chiquita Warren. Chiquita Warren stepped into the ring weighing 137.25 pounds. He was wearing gold trunks with blue stripe. McGirt stepped into the ring weighing 138.5 pounds. He had blue trunks with white stripe. He was 36-1. Warren was 25-0. And Warren was dropped in the 8th round. And he would be stopped 1 minute and 23 seconds of the 12th round because of a swollen left eye. That was their second bout. The first bout was in 1986. So now McGirt is the IBF junior welterweight champion of the world. 1984, Los Angeles Olympic Games. 9 gold medals were brought back to this country. Evander Holyfield, Mark Breland, Virgil Hill, Tyrell Biggs, Pernell Whitaker, Steve McCrory, Meldrick Taylor, Frank Tate, and Henry Tillman. The star of that team, in my opinion, was the young man of Philadelphia who was 17 years old. His name was Meldrick TNT Taylor. Now, Meldrick Taylor would bring home a gold medal. He was signed with Main Events. He would begin his professional debut with the rest of the Olympics in New York's Madison Square Garden, called the Night of Gold. Although Mark Breland was from Brooklyn, New York, he was the hometown hero. Meldrick Taylor was the star. He would move on and have several fights, immediately jump into the top 10. I was at the fight when he faced Harold Brazier. I was at the fight when he faced Robin Blake. I was even at the fight when he faced Cubanito Perez in Atlantic City. I was in the second row of all those fights. When he faced Cubanito Perez, Angelo Dundee and Eddie Futch was in his corner. That's the first time they ever worked together. That's the first time there was a power brain in the corner. Cubanito Perez kept all the money. Those two gentlemen worked pro bono. Cubanito Perez had faced Hector Camacho, so he was a name that Meldrick Taylor needed. Meldrick Taylor was splendid in that fight. Hand speed like you won't believe. But he was complaining in the corner to Georgie Benton that Cubanito Perez was talking to him in the corner. He would win that fight. He would look magnificent. And suddenly, Meldrick Taylor was the man that they were looking at. So now you have Meldrick Taylor chasing around James Buddy McGirt. He wanted to get a title. So James Buddy McGirt would face Howard Davis, the 1976 Olympian. He would win a gold medal. But he didn't do as well as Sugar Ray Leonard and the Spinks brothers. So he would face James Buddy McGirt, and he would be knocked out in 2 rounds in Madison Square Garden. I was in the second row of that fight. Meldrick Taylor comes in with Lou Duva into the ring, and he calls out James Buddy McGirt. They were going to get the fight going, and McGirt would unfortunately tear his bicep and hurt his rotator cuff. So the fight was called off. Meldrick Taylor began to shed tears because he saw an opportunity slip through his fingers. So he would continue, and he would hurt his knee. Now, he would defeat Buddy McGirt in 1988. I was at that fight. And he fought him in Atlantic City. He would defeat Buddy McGirt. Buddy McGirt was not himself. He made a mistake. He shouldn't have fought under the medication that he was on to treat his torn rotator cuff or his bicep. So Meldrick Taylor defeats Buddy McGirt and becomes the IBF Junior Welterweight Champion. He would injure his knee, and he would be out of action. He would make a comeback in Atlantic City. I'm in the second row of that fight. He would fight a fighter by the name of Courtney Hooper. Meldrick Taylor came in with a knee brace. He did the Ollie Shuffle when he got in the ring. He wanted to show the reporters he meant business. During the course of the fight, Frank Cappuccino was the referee. And Courtney Hooper would be warned several times of low blows to Meldrick Taylor. Meldrick Taylor would eventually win the fight. As he was getting out of the ring, he was being heckled by Livingston Brambo. because Bramble wanted to fight. As Meldrick Taylor and Lou Duver will wave away Livingston Bramble, who, by the way, was a former pupil of the main event camp, Meldrick Taylor would go into the press conference. There he would be met with Julio Cesar Chavez. Chavez would have the WBC Junior Welterweight Championship contest. He had the belt. So Chavez would call out Meldrick Taylor because Meldrick Taylor called out Julio Cesar Chavez. Now, how I felt that Chavez would defeat Taylor, although I was a big supporter of Taylor, was because I was at the fight in Las Vegas, Nevada, when Julio Cesar Chavez would run into a hard puncher from Puerto Rico, and his name was Edwin El Chapo Rosario. Rosario would meet Hector Camacho in 1986 in New York's Madison Square Garden. I was at that fight. And he would hurt Hector Camacho 2 separate occasions. But he couldn't finish the job. On the undercard of that fight was Iron Mike Tyson, and he would knock out a fighter in 2 rounds. June 13th, 1986, against Reggie Gross. Now, Rosario would take on Julio Cesar Chavez in Las Vegas, Nevada. And Chavez methodically broke down Edwin El Chapo Rosario, who, by the way, was one of the hardest punchers in the lightweight division. He knocked out Bramble in 2 rounds. Livingston Bramble couldn't see out of his eye, and he basically resigned on his knee. And on the undercard of that fight was Cornelius Boza Edwards and Macho Camacho. So, in the Las Vegas fight, when Julio Cesar Chavez methodically broke down Edwin El Chapo Rosario, Iron Mike Tyson was the water boy for Rosario because that was his camp. They were in the same stable. That told me Meldrick Taylor would not be able to keep Julio Cesar Chavez off of him because Taylor couldn't punch. He had fast hands and fast feet, and he had a Philadelphia heart without the punching power. Not at junior welterweight. Lightweight, featherweight, yes. Not at junior welterweight. So these 2 men would meet up on the night of March 17th, 1990, in Las Vegas, Nevada. I'm in the 2nd row of that fight. The fight is going well, but on the inside, Chavez is busting up Meldrick Taylor as he counterpunches him. Taylor makes it to the 12th round. 25 seconds left. Taylor is up, he's ahead on the scorecards. He gets tagged with 25 seconds left on the clock. You can see he's now disoriented because he's now going after Chavez as though he's behind on points because of that 1 punch. He gets spun around in the corner. There's now 9 seconds left on the clock. Richard Steele is the referee. The red blinking lights begin to blink. That's how you know it's 10 seconds left. 10 seconds is very important in a championship fight, but when it's the last round, you cannot be saved. You can be saved by the bell in Las Vegas. So when the bell rings, the fight is over, and you can be saved by the bell. In the case of Richard Steele, he did not, in my opinion, give the benefit of a doubt to Meldrick Taylor. The red blinking light was brought in New York's Madison Square Garden when a young man by the name of who they called Dummy Eugene Hairston. Now they call him Silent Eugene Hairston. He couldn't hear and he couldn't see back in the 1950s. And he hit a man after the bell because he couldn't hear the bell, and they would disqualify him. The commission was taken to court, so they had to do something because there was a referee who couldn't hear as well. So they came up with the red blinking light. Well, this red blinking light was brought into Madison Square Garden. Now we get back to the fight with Julio Cesar Chavez and Meldrick Taylor. Richard Steele saw the red blinking light. He's concentrating on Meldrick Taylor. Meldrick Taylor gets up at the count of 6. He cannot focus on Richard Steele because he's somewhat disoriented, but at the same time, he had enough wits about him to take a look and see what the commotion was about to his right. What the commotion was, Lou Duva stepped on the canvas. Now that could have disqualified Meldrick Taylor in and of itself. But they concentrated on the fact that Lou Duva stepped on the canvas because he pointed out to Richard Steele that Julio Cesar Chavez wandered out of the corner. He was saying send him back, because he was trying to buy time and take the concentration off Richard Steele, off of his fighter. That cost the fighter because the fighter didn't respond to the questions that were asked. Are you okay? There were 2 seconds left in that fight. That cost Meldrick Taylor the fight. Now, why I'm equating this fight with Frank Craig, the Harlem Coffee Cooler, and Joe Butler. That was the impact that that fight had in the streets of Philadelphia, in the streets of Harlem, New York. It was the most upsetting event because everyone was looking forward to seeing that fight. The best was Frank Craig at that time in Harlem, and the best was Joe Butler in Philadelphia. And that's the impact that you had when you learned about the story of that fight. My God, the parades they had in the streets of Harlem. Amazing. Just amazing. Now, Frank Craig would become the colored world middleweight champion when he would defeat Joe Butler. And he would have battles with the England middleweight. He was a champion. His name was Dan Creedon. Dan Creedon was born June 9th, 1868 in New Zealand. That would be the same country as Tom Heaney, who would face Gene Tunney in Gene Tunney's last fight in 1928. Tom Heaney was called The Rock. He was a very strong fighter. But Dan Creedon would be New Zealand's next champion. He would die July 10th, 1942 in Melbourne, Victoria, Australia, and he stood 5 foot 8 inches. And he weighed 157 to 160 to 165 pounds. He was managed by Rob Roy Benton. Now, why is this significant? Well, let's talk about it. In 1891, Dan Creedon took on a fighter by the name of Edward Starlight Rawlins. Fought on October 17th of that year in Melbourne, Australia. Now, Edward Starlight Rawlins was a black fighter. He was born 1852 near Georgetown in British Guyana. He stood 6 foot and weighed 150 to 165 pounds. He was an Australian middleweight champion contender. He was a very good fighter with Starlight Eddie Rawlins. He'd be stopped in 7 rounds by Dan Creedon. What is the significance of where I'm going with this? August 6, 1892, he would take on Edward Starlight Rawlins once again. They would fight in Melbourne, Australia. This time would be a 4-round draw. Now, Dan Creedon would become the middleweight champion of Australia. Why is this important? He was sparred with Jim Corbett. He was sparred with Bob Fitzsimmons. He took on Frank Craig February 7th, 1894 in New York. He would defeat him in 4 rounds. He would take on Bobby Dobbs May 21st. He fought in Pittsburgh. It was an exhibition. Bobby Dobbs was a colored lightweight champion. he fought Joe Gans 3 times. He gave Joe Gans an opportunity to fight for his colored lightweight championship title twice. Once was a draw and one was a victory for Bobby Dobbs. He would eventually lose to Joe Gans, who in my opinion is the greatest lightweight champion of boxing history. He would take on Tommy White. Tommy White was a black fighter. He would defeat him in 3 rounds, June 4th of that year in Chicago. He would have another exhibition with Bobby Dobbs. I remember when he fought Tom Tracy. It was supposed to be a contest, but they turned it into an exhibition. But why this is so intriguing? Because Dan Creedon had faced a man by the name of Jim Smith. Jim Smith had faced Jake Kilrain in 1887 in America. They were fighting for the Police Gazette belt in the heavyweight division. Now, when Jim Smith faced Dan Creedon, he faced him January 27th of 1896. But in 1887, Jim Smith would take on Jake Kilrain. Jake Kilrain would defeat Jim Smith. He would become the Police Gazette heavyweight champion. In 1889, Jake Kilrain would take on John O'Sullivan, who was the bare-knuckle champion of America. John O'Sullivan and Jake Kilrain will have a fight in Mississippi that would last 7 hours and a half to complete. Both men were disfigured in that fight. Their metacarpals were scraped off. They would crawl back to their corners, vomiting along the way. One of the most brutal contests that became the last bare-knuckle championship title match in boxing history. Why is all this significant? Because Frank Craig, on October 14, 1895, would last 20 rounds for the British version of the middleweight championship contest. That's a milestone. The first time something like that ever happened was in 1810 in England, when the second fighter of America, who was Tom Molyneux, would take on Tom Cribb. That would be the first black and white championship fight, mixed race. 33 rounds that fight would last. Tom Molyneux would knock out Tom Cribb. Tom Molyneux was only allowed to have one man in his corner, and that was his mentor, the first fighter of America, who also faced Tom Cribb in 1804. His name was Bill Richmond. Bill Richmond was the only man in the corner of Tom Molyneux. And Tom Cribb had 7 men in his corner. When he was knocked out, all 7 men stormed the ring. One man hit Tom Molyneux in the back of the head with an iron pipe. Tom Molyneux goes down. They trample over Tom Molyneux, stomping on his hands. He tries to get up, but his hands won't work. He clenches his fist in pain. At that time, one of the stablemates, if you will, one of the sparring partners, who was in the corner of Tom Cribb, would sprinkle some pellets around the body of Tom Molyneux. Then they would complain and state that Tom Molyneux had iron pellets in his hands. And they tried to get him disqualified. So since they could not get him disqualified, they bought time for their charge, Tom Cribb. As Tom Cribb would recover, Tom Molyneux would still be in pain. His hands were basically broken. He was basically an MMA fighter, not a stand-up fighter. So he kept going back to the MMA tactics, and they kept breaking it up to a point where he got exhausted and he couldn't continue. And Tom Cribb would remain the European heavyweight champion. Well, if you look back to George Dixon, he would be the first fighter, black or white, to win a title overseas. He would be the first athlete in any sport to win a championship title overseas. He would get that credential because Tom Molineaux was cheated out of his championship victory over Tom Cribb in 1810. When you look at Frank Craig, the Harlem Coffee Cooler, and you look at Dan Creedon, that would be the next opportunity of an American fighter to win a championship title overseas. George Dixon was from Canada. Frank Craig was from America. He is a milestone. He went 20 rounds for the championship title of England with Dan Creedon. Dan Creedon defeated Jim Smith. Jim Smith fought for the heavyweight championship title with Jake Kilrain. Dan Creedon defeated Jim Smith. But yet Frank Craig went 20 rounds with him. That is absolutely historic. And that's why I have Frank Craig as a milestone fighter. Frank Craig would take on fighters such as Fred Morris, Tommy Ryan. Tommy Ryan was a welterweight and middleweight champion, one of the most underrated fighters in boxing history. He took on Tommy West, who would become a champion, had his fits, the Barbados Demon, Joe Walcott. He was in the ring with Jack Root, who the World Light Heavyweight Championship division was created for in 1903. He was in the ring with George Gardner, who was the first light heavyweight champion in boxing history. He was in the ring with Denver Ed Martin, who was a colored heavyweight champion. Let's talk about Denver Ed Martin for one moment. Denver Ed Martin was born September 10th, 1881. He died May 11th, 1937. He was born in Denver, Colorado, and he died in Oakland, California. He stood 6'3.5", became the colored heavyweight champion February 24th, 1902, when defeated Frank Childs. Now, Frank Childs was the crafty Texan. He would defeat Frank Childs. On February 5th, 1903, he would lose his title to Jack Johnson in 20 rounds. He was in the ring with Bob Armstrong. Bob Armstrong became the colored heavyweight champion when he defeated a fighter by the name of Charlie Strong. That title became vacant when the Black Prince Peter Jackson would relinquish the title before he would die at the age of 40. Bob Armstrong was a good sparring partner for Jim Jeffries, Jack Dempsey, Jack Johnson, Tom Sharkey, Bob Fitzsimmons, many of them. Would also take on Ed Gunboat Smith, Frank Craig, the Harlem Coffee Cooler, Sam McVeigh, the Oxnard Cyclone, Hank Griffin, Klondike Haynes. By the way, Klondike Haynes and Sam Langford would fight for the Black Heavyweight Championship. That was basically the claimant for the Colored Heavyweight Championship title. And what was interesting about all of this was that he took the title from Joe Butler. Now, who was Joe Butler? He was the king of the middleweights. He was born May 18th, 1866 in Pennsylvania. He stood 6'1.5", weighed 156 to 175 pounds. He was managed by Tom O'Rourke. He was in the ring with C.A.C. Smith, Jim Daly, Frank Craig, Ed Bingley. Ed Bingley was the Negro middleweight champion. That title would become vacant when it was not defended. And once the Negro middleweight championship title became extinct, in came the colored middleweight championship division. So Ed Bingley was a milestone. Frank Petty Slavin, who was in the ring with Peter Jackson. Johnny Banks, Peter Jackson himself, Peter Maher, Bobby Dobbs, Bob Armstrong, Harry Peppers, Frank Childs, George Cole, Jack Johnson, young Peter Jackson, Philadelphia Jack O'Brien, Jim Jeffords, were just a few fighters that Joe Butler was in the ring with, and that's why that fight was so significant that it belongs in the laws of pugilism. And that was very important. And that's why I'm placing Frank Craig, the Harlem Coffee Cooler, in this conversation. I'm Scrapbook Boxing, Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuff series, stating all great fights and all great fighters will never be forgotten on my channel. We'll continue this conversation with the complete history of boxing in our next video. Thanks for watching. Be well. Peace.